Thank you for coming today to pray for the repose of the soul of Pope Benedict XVI. We're honored to have here brother priest, deacons. Particularly, I draw attention to the boys who are students at the Sacred Heart Apostolic School, which is in Rolling Prairie, sponsored by the Legionaries of Christ, as a pre-seminary for those considering whether the Lord may call them to the priesthood. We're also blessed to have not only our Franciscan rector here, Father Mike Sarufka, but we also have accompanying during some time of academic sabbatical, one of their prominent Franciscan priest as well, Father Jason Well, who is on faculty of a pontifical institute in Rome, and who after Mass today will offer some further theological reflections on the life, the ministry of Pope Benedict. So stay tuned after Mass for some remarks from him as well. Now, we have a tradition of a last will and testament. A last will and testament, which sometimes you see on TV, whether they gather people together and they say, and now we are going to have the reading of the will. And normally it would be a dramatic time where they apportion property and so on. And yet, not just the last will, but a testament is oftentimes an expression of one's reflection on his or her life. This is my testament that is read upon the death of the individual. Now, we have a strong tradition of something called a spiritual testament. A spiritual testament that is unique to our popes in the Catholic Church. And so it is read upon their passing as something of a spiritual offering, a window into their own life and ministry, a reflection on the life of faith that they have experienced, and also a word of inspiration for those of us who now experience their loss. By the way, you can go online. I was able to find them going back at least to Pius XII, but you can certainly see them. And Pope Benedict was no exception to this tradition. Pope Benedict left, and I'll quote excerpts from it in my homily today, but Pope Benedict left a spiritual testament. It was really a reflection on his own life, full of gratitude, and also leaving us with some of the key themes that he thought would be important for all of us to reflect upon at the time of his passing. Now, the readings that we have chosen today are actually the same readings that were used not at the funeral Mass for Pope Benedict, but rather they are the readings that he chose or that were given for his inauguration Mass in the year 2005. So these readings go back to the commencement of his Petrine ministry and give us that sense of forward-looking at the moment that he was inaugurated as Pope. And so we have two central themes that arise from this. One is salvation is found in Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is the anchor, and there is no other name but his name by means of which we will be saved. This is from St. Peter himself, successor that Pope Benedict would become in Acts chapter 4. The gospel passage that was used and that we heard today would have emphasized that complete abandonment to the love of Jesus and service of his flock. The love of Jesus and service of his flock. Those two completely intertwined. That our ministry is rooted in our love for Jesus, and our love for Jesus propels us to serve his people. And these themes of the truth of the revelation of Jesus Christ, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and the self-giving ministry rooted in love of Jesus that Pope Benedict gave to all of us, are good anchors on which to reflect upon the life and the ongoing legacy of Pope Benedict. Now, the spiritual testimony that is given to us, Pope Benedict wrote within a year of being named pontiff. He was elected and inaugurated his ministry in 2005, and then by 2006, at the end of August, he wrote his spiritual testament. Now, it's interesting, at that time, he would have been 79 years old. His personal secretary has given the account that Pope Benedict eventually, when he renounced the papacy and resigned, that even at that time he thought he wouldn't have had much longer to live. And so Pope Benedict wrote this at age 79, and then he lived to be 95 years old. So he lived another 16 years after this. But he begins by saying, now mind you, he has 17 more years. He says, when at this late hour of my life, I look back on the decades I have wandered through, I see, first of all, how much reason I have to give thanks. And so his heart is full of thanks. We might want to ask ourselves, as I offer some reflections on what Pope Benedict has given, if we had to go through the exercise, and maybe it shouldn't just be an exercise, but it's something we should do, to write a spiritual testament, what would we be thankful for? How would we look back at whatever age we find ourselves? Pope Benedict thought it was the latest stage of his life. He was 79. He had 17 more years to live, 16 more years to live. What would we reflect upon at whatever age we find ourselves as being an object of thanks and gratitude? And so, of course, he gives thanks to God. He says, who has guided me through all kinds of confusion, who has always picked me up when I began to slip, who has always given me anew the light of his countenance. In retrospect, I see and understand that even the dark and arduous stretches of this path were for my salvation, and that he guided me well in those very stretches. And so he admits of times, and we all can do the same, where no one but Christ alone, God alone, will sustain us during arduous, difficult, and dark times. Now, one can read a more thorough biography of Pope Benedict to know everything from being in Nazi Germany as a youth, through theological travails and challenges, that certainly he would not have lived an easy life, and he relied on Jesus. After God, he thanks his family. He thanks his parents, his father, his mother, his sister, and his brother. And he reflects on the beautiful gift and gifts that they have given to him in the life of love and faith. And so perhaps for us, if we were to leave behind a testament and someone were to read it, who would we thank? He thanks his family. Then he says, I thank God from the bottom of my heart for the many friends, men and women, whom he has always placed at my side. He also thanks God for the beautiful home in the foothills of the Alps, so that he could see the splendor of the Creator himself in the very creation and see that beauty of faith. And then he thanks God for his friends that he eventually made in Rome and Italy, which became his second home. Knowing Jesus was the foundational principle of Pope Benedict. And though he had a towering intellect and relied on the truth of Christ with an intellectual integrity that I dare say none of us here will be able to approach, he said in his first encyclical the following: "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea. Even though we can think through the ethics of a situation, we can posit theories about God, God is not that. Being Christian is the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction." It's that encounter with Jesus that gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. In light of the love that Christ has for him, the next thing that Pope Francis does is ask for forgiveness. Pope Benedict, rather, asks for forgiveness. In his spiritual testament, he writes, "I ask for forgiveness from the bottom of my heart from all those whom I have wronged in some way. I ask for forgiveness from the bottom of my heart from all those whom I have wronged in some way." Now, we've never taught that popes are sinless, far from it. When Pius XII had his spiritual testament, and he said something like this, acknowledging his need for forgiveness, there were some who tried to kind of translate it in a way that wouldn't quite be so explicit that he had admitted he was a sinner. We're all sinners. And in fact, it was Dorothy Day who gave the clearest translation. She was an enormous fan of Pius XII, writing his own acknowledgement of sin. Now, why do I mention this? Is Pope Benedict here just flat out says, "I beg for forgiveness for those who I have wronged in some way." Now, we live in a culture in which oftentimes requesting forgiveness is very qualified. It's the following phraseology. If somebody says something that stirs up controversy afterwards, they will often say something like this: "If I have offended you, I am sorry, that wasn't my intention." That's not an apology. It's just saying, if you don't like what I said, if I offended you, I'm sorry you're offended. But it's not an admission that what was said was wrong or in fact caused harm. It isn't a retraction, it's just saying, gosh, I didn't want you to feel bad by what I said. But it's not a true apology. It's not saying, in the world's terminology, I'm sorry. I did wrong and I should not have done that. I ask for your forgiveness. Pope Benedict gives us a clear request for forgiveness from the bottom of his heart for all those, as he puts it, whom I have wronged in some way. And that's a good example for all of us. It's a good example for all of us to ask for forgiveness and to call upon the mercy of the Lord. He concludes with an admonition that we stay strong in the faith. He goes through all of the different challenges, theological and otherwise, that the modern world has thrust upon the faith, making us believe that there is greater reliability in the world of science than there is in the world of faith. Pope Benedict, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, lived his life in service of the truth for and he saw no contradiction between faith and reason, faith and science, and says so many sudden discoveries of science upon further reflection, in fact, reveal more deeply the truths of the faith. And so he says the reasonableness of the faith is emerging anew. And so his last words to us, written these many years ago but released after his death, are to hold strong to the truth of the faith, to hold strong to Jesus, to not just give way to every wind of contemporary thought that would seek to strip away the depth of our truth in Jesus Christ. Perhaps the most famous homily that Pope Benedict gave was the week before he was elected Pope. He was the Dean of the College of Cardinals, and in one of the intervening masses following the death of St. John Paul II, gave his own homily. It's largely considered that that homily, among other things, was so well received that it inspired his brother cardinals to then elect him Pope. And he gives this famous line in 2005. We are moving toward a dictatorship of relativism which does not recognize anything as for certain and which has as its highest goal one's own ego and one's own desires. Now let's unpack this for a moment. See, if there is no objective truth, then it's all up for grabs. If there is no norm of what is true and what is right, then it's simply a matter of opinion. I think this is right. You think that is right. I think this is wrong. You think that is wrong. And so it all becomes relative to the person who, on their own, detached from any objective truth, simply says, what I say goes. End of story. And what he says is then the standard becomes the highest goal is one's own ego and one's own desire. If there is an objective truth in the universe, then we live in light of that truth. But if it doesn't exist, then a different perspective holds sway. And the relativism which seeks to say what's good for you may not be good for me, and what's bad for you may not be bad for me, and it's all a matter of subjective opinion, then that becomes a dictatorship. And he lived through a century in which those totalitarian expressions were let loose in Europe to devastating effect. And so his hunger for the truth was always rooted in the fact that we are living under the light, the reason, the love, the truth that God has given us in Jesus Christ. And that truth is liberating, and that truth is freeing, and that truth is forgiving, and that truth is guiding, and that truth gives us hope, and that truth doesn't depend on my opinion, and that truth makes us the men and women we're called to be. I'll conclude with two final quotations. In 2009, he said, "True knowledge of God consists in a personal, profound experience of Jesus Christ and of his love. Dear brothers and sisters, this is true for every Christian. Faith is first and foremost a personal, intimate encounter with Jesus. It is having an experience of his closeness, his friendship, and his love. It is in this way that we learn to know him even better, to love him, and to follow him more and more. May this happen to each one of us." In his apostolic journey in March of 2012 to Mexico and Cuba, he says, "If we allow the love of Christ to change our heart, we can then change the world. This is the secret of authentic happiness." Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, lived that truth. He ended with a prayer that we should all ask. I've had some people say, do you think Pope Benedict, do you think Pope Benedict is in heaven? Now, if you ask me what I think yes. That's what I think. But I don't presume that. What I know is that we pray for all those who've passed away. And so we pray for Pope Benedict, never presuming, but always calling upon the mercy of Jesus for him and for all of us. And this is what he last said in his spiritual testament. Finally, I humbly ask, pray for me, so that the Lord may admit me to the eternal dwellings, despite all my sins and shortcomings. For all those entrusted to me, my heartfelt prayer goes out day after day. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him.